Hello friends. Welcome to my channel.
At midnight, the deep silence and darkness of the cemetery had settled among the tombstones. It was drizzling, and a light mist hovered over the graveyard. Jacob, the gravekeeper, sat in his small cabin, listening to crackling music from his old radio. Staying alone in the cemetery at night was something most people feared, but Jacob had been doing this job for years and was used to it. However, this night was different from the others. While sitting in his cabin, Jacob started hearing strange sounds coming from the depths of the cemetery. At first, he thought it was just the wind howling or the noise of animals, but the sounds became clearer and more disturbing. Suddenly, the radio went silent, leaving only the cemetery's quiet. Jacob took his flashlight and stepped outside. The damp air and cold wind of the graveyard made his hair stand on end. As he slowly walked among the tombstones, he looked around carefully with each step. After a few steps, he saw a movement behind a tombstone. His heart began to race. "Who's there?" he called out, but received no answer. When he pointed his flashlight in the direction of the movement, he saw only empty tombstones and the moss growing on them. He tried to take a deep breath to calm himself, but the uneasiness inside him was growing. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound behind him. He quickly turned around and pointed his flashlight in the direction of the sound. A few meters away, he saw a figure standing next to an old and crumbling tombstone. The figure seemed to be illuminated by a pale light and was looking at Jacob. There was a terrifying expression in its eyes, and Jacob felt that he saw something inhuman in those eyes. As his heart pounded, Jacob took a few steps back. The figure suddenly disappeared, and Jacob looked around in disbelief. This must be a hallucination, he thought, but the fear inside him continued to grow. Jacob started to walk quickly back to his cabin, but with each step, he felt as if something was following him. When he reached his cabin, he quickly shut the door and went inside. He placed the flashlight on the table and tried to breathe deeply. Suddenly, he heard a tapping sound on the window of his cabin. When he looked at the window in fear, he saw a handprint on the glass. This print seemed to be looking inside, and Jacob realized that the print was from the outside. He quickly grabbed his flashlight and went outside, but saw no one in front of the window. But when he looked around, he noticed shadows moving among the tombstones. These shadows felt as if they were watching him from every corner of the cemetery. Jacob, trying to overcome his fear, went back to his cabin and locked the door. The radio started working again, but this time it only made static noises. Jacob sat in the corner of his cabin and covered his face with his hands. This night, there was much more than just the usual silence of the cemetery. The fear inside him combined with the strange sounds coming from the depths of the cemetery, growing larger. Jacob did not know if he would survive this night, but one thing was certain. The dark secrets of the cemetery would be revealed tonight. Jacob tried to turn off the radio with his trembling hands, but the static noises wouldn't stop. He closed his eyes tightly and tried to calm himself by taking deep breaths. However, the uneasiness inside him was growing, like a darkness approaching from every corner of the cemetery. Suddenly, there was a violent knock on the cabin door. Jacob jumped up, grabbed his flashlight, and walked towards the door. When he opened it, he saw no one. But right in front of the door, there lay an old piece of a tombstone. The inscriptions on it were faded, with only a few letters remaining. As Jacob pondered where the stone came from, a cold wind blew from behind him, and the cabin door slammed shut. Jacob quickly turned and tried to open the door, but it felt like it was locked from the inside. As his heart raced, he looked out the window. In the dark corners of the cemetery, he saw shadows moving. These shadows seemed to be getting closer to him. As Jacob desperately thought about what to do, he suddenly heard a faint murmur inside the cabin. This sound echoed as if it came from the depths of the cemetery. He closed his eyes and tried to listen carefully. The murmur sounded like someone was praying, but the words were indistinguishable. The air inside the cabin suddenly grew cold, and Jacob felt a deep chill. He turned on his flashlight and looked around, but saw nothing. For a moment, he noticed a movement in the corner of the cabin. When he pointed his flashlight in that direction, he saw a pair of eyes looking at him. These eyes were not like human eyes. They were like a pair of lights shining from the darkness. Jacob tightly gripped his flashlight with trembling hands and walked towards the owner of those eyes. With each step, the eyes seemed to glow brighter. Finally, when he reached the corner, the eyes suddenly disappeared, and Jacob found himself staring at an empty wall. As he stepped back in fear, he felt a hand behind him. He quickly turned around, but saw no one. At that moment, he heard a whisper outside the cabin. The whisper repeated Jacob's name. "Jacob, Jacob." The voice sounded like an echo coming from the depths of the cemetery. Jacob tried to open the cabin door in fear, but it was still locked. Suddenly, he felt a cold breeze inside the cabin, and his flashlight went out. Darkness completely surrounded Jacob, and he started having difficulty breathing. The fear inside him had become unbearable. He closed his eyes tightly and began to pray loudly. But his prayers were not enough against the dark forces of the cemetery. Suddenly, the cabin door flew open, and a cold wind rushed in. Jacob quickly ran towards the door and stepped outside. The cemetery was still dark and silent, but the uneasiness inside him had combined with the shadows moving among the tombstones. Jacob ran towards a large monument grave standing in the middle of the cemetery. This grave was one of the oldest and largest in the cemetery. When he stood in front of the monument, he suddenly noticed the stone on the grave moving. His eyes widened in horror, and he wanted to turn around and run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. A hand slowly reached out from under the tombstone. Jacob stepped back in fear, but he knew there was nowhere to escape. This was a sign of a curse coming from the depths of the cemetery. The fear inside him had become unbearable, and Jacob had become a prisoner of the dark secrets of the cemetery that night. As Jacob stood frozen in front of the grave, the hand emerging from the ground slowly reached up and grasped the edge of the tombstone. Holding his breath, Jacob retreated. His eyes widened with horror, and his heart raced. He had no idea what lay beneath this grave, but the fear he felt in that moment was the most intense he had ever experienced. When the hand fully emerged, a figure appeared from the grave. This figure was dressed in old, tattered clothes, its face pale and shrouded in shadows. As Jacob looked into the figure's eyes, he felt his fear multiply. The figure began to slowly advance toward him. As Jacob tried to back away, he stumbled against a tombstone and fell to the ground. The figure continued to approach slowly, and Jacob tried to crawl away, but the figure kept coming. Jacob was struggling to breathe, his heart pounding as if it might burst from his chest. Suddenly, a scream pierced the silence of the cemetery. As Jacob tried to distance himself from the figure, this scream, echoing from the depths of the graveyard, shattered the night's darkness. When Jacob looked in the direction of the scream, he saw other figures moving among the tombstones. These figures were advancing toward him from the dark corners of the cemetery. Jacob quickly got to his feet and ran towards his cabin. But with every step, he felt the figures behind him getting closer. When he reached his cabin, he opened the door quickly and went inside. He shut the door and locked it, panting heavily. For a moment, the silence inside calmed him, but this peace was short-lived. When he looked out the window of the cabin, he saw the figures approaching. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and it felt as though they were ready to steal Jacob's soul. Jacob tried to overcome his fear and tightly grasped an old rosary in his hand. This rosary had been passed down from his father years ago and always gave him strength. He closed his eyes and began to pray. The prayers formed a defense against the dark forces of the cemetery. However, as the figures stood right in front of the window, staring inside, Jacob's prayers were not enough. Suddenly, the radio inside the cabin started working again. This time, instead of a crackling melody, a deep and ominous voice was heard. This voice seemed to echo from the depths of the cemetery and penetrated Jacob's soul. Jacob tried to turn off the radio, but the sound kept getting louder. The fear inside him had become unbearable. The cabin door suddenly swung open, and a cold wind rushed in. When Jacob turned around, he saw the figure standing at the door. This figure was larger and more terrifying than the others. Its eyes shone with a light that pierced Jacob's soul. As Jacob stepped back, the figure slowly entered. Jacob continued to pray, raising his hands, but the figure kept advancing. When its eyes met Jacob's, Jacob felt a chill within him. This was the true face of the cemetery's curse. Suddenly, the figure stopped and looked at Jacob. "Why are you here?" it asked in a deep, ominous voice. Jacob tried to answer with a trembling voice. I am just the gravekeeper," he said. The figure nodded and took another step towards Jacob. "This cemetery is our home. Let us rest in peace here," the figure said. Jacob, with tears in his eyes, nodded. I'm just doing my job," he said. The figure extended its hand towards Jacob and then suddenly disappeared. Jacob collapsed to the ground, taking a deep breath. The fear inside him was slowly fading. However, the cemetery's secrets were still there, and Jacob knew he would never forget the terror he experienced that night.
I hope you had a good time. If you liked my story, do not forget to comment and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye. See you in the next story.